being into quadrants. Then I'm going to talk about the program and policy portion of the requirements, address public feedback, talk about how to treat existing sites, and then talk about the key deliverable, the transition plan, and then make some comments about reporting that will occur between now and when the project ends in September of 2026. I'm hitting you wrong. There we go. Come on. All right. Can you advance it?
Yeah.
All right.
You might be able to work now too.
Right. But quickly, what is the ADA? It became effective actually quite a ways back, January 26th of 1992, for the 89,000 units of local government across the United States. Obviously, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, but it defines discrimination in a way that might surprise you. It says that an existing site that's not accessible is discrimination on the basis of disability. It says that programs and policies that are not inclusive of people who have a disability rise to the level of discrimination on the basis of disability. So those are all parts of the scope here. And because the scope of the ADA is so broad, I think appropriately so, the WestCOG project scope is broad as well. The ADA doesn't just tell you can't do certain things, though. It also imposes some very affirmative mandates. Those two have been worked into the scope, and I'll touch on those too. Just a comment about things in Washington, D.C. This is not a political comment. We see this thick political approach no matter who is elected from which party. There's generally, when there's a Republican elected as president, there are fewer civil rights staff. It's happened every year for the last 33 years. So we expect as much as a 50% cut in civil rights staff, but that's not going to change the content. When this has happened in the past, the content of settlement agreements and court decisions has remained exactly the same. But we do think there will be an impact because there will simply be fewer Department of Justice staff to receive complaints and investigate complaints. We are still seeing a continued trend from towns and cities and special purpose districts of issuing RFPs for ADA compliance. So 33 years into the life of this law, and agencies are still realizing that they want to do this and need to do it, in part because of the changing demographic groups. Our firm is an architectural and engineering firm, but we added Access Consulting in 2008. We work all over the country and are licensed in all 50 states, and we serve just about everybody. We are an MBE in collaboration with our partner Draft Pros, and we have about 300 employees nationwide. And our accessibility practice is just the 9 of us, and unique to other ADA consultants, 7 of the 9 of us worked in local government, and I had the pleasure of being an administrator. So what is the quad approach? So there is no way to do all 16 of the participating WestCOG communities at once. We did briefly consider that, but that was just not going to be effective. So we tried to balance that by putting you into groups of 4. The scope of work for all 16 is the same though: project management, inventory verification, access audit, site reports, program policy review, public feedback, transition plan, a capital report that gives you a cost reference for planning purposes about the retrofits, and then of course interactive final reporting, and we're going to do that on the quad basis. We tried to balance the quads by population, proximity, number of parks, trails, and facilities. I'd say we hit a home run on a couple of them and maybe missed on a couple of others, but it is still working. Quad 1 started with Darien, Reading, New Milford, and Norwalk. That's going to last roughly September of last year through July of this year. Quad 2 is Stamford. In fact, we have a team in Stamford this week. Westport, Weston, and Wilton. That's gonna run through roughly August of 2025. We do expect some overlap here. Yeah, it went back. Try one more forward for me. Quad 3 is Bethel, Bridgewater, Greenwich, and Newtown. And then quad 4 is Danbury, Brookfield, New Fairfield, and Sherman. And we expect that to take us roughly through August of 2026. We're also including reporting to WestCOG on a periodic basis, and then of course at the project conclusion. I think when a lot of people hear the Americans with Disabilities Act, they think brick and mortar, and that certainly is a piece of it, but this is really an important part. Programs and policies or opportunities that each of the municipalities makes available to your residents are also subject to the ADA. So programs are defined, of course, as a thing that meets at a certain time that I pay a fee for, and it's at a certain location and it lasts for 8 weeks. But it's also a sidewalk that's been decided by a court as a program. It's also playgrounds, trails, beaches, campsites, public comment at one of your board meetings. So that's why the scope includes evaluating your programs and policies and talking to your staff about how they invite, analyze, and fulfill requests for reasonable modification. From a policy perspective, we'll look at things like service animals, other power-driven mobility devices, rental and reservation forms, and so forth. So this is a really important piece. It ends up in a separate report that talks about how you matched up against the Title II regulation. So again, I think a lot of people think of brick and mortar first when they hear ADA. You know, I would urge you to green light this for your staff. We've had a couple of staff ask us, is this really a part of the scope? And of course it is. It's part of what Title II requires, and it's part of the WestCOG project. Community engagement is another piece. So I'll call these two the sets of soft tasks involved here. You can't have a transition plan without community engagement or public feedback. So this is a really critical piece of this. And as we go through, and I'll use Town of Reading as an example, we just did their community engagement March 3rd, 4th, 5th, I think it was. And the point of it is to ask your residents who have a disability, do you have a preference or priority as to the order of retrofit? And is it something that is meaningful to you? Because that can influence our final recommendations to the town or to the city. We recognize that each city, each municipality is different, but you'll get at Sherman a different report than Bethel will, than Bridgewater will, than Newtown. So we want to tie your own citizens' preferences into that. So again, I'd ask you to green light that too. We've had a couple of times where staff have said, is this really a part of the project? And indeed it is. We do the public feedback in two different methods. One is an in-person freestanding meeting. Since the pandemic, candidly, I'm surprised if we get 10 people to show up at an in-person meeting. These tend to be fairly positive in nature. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's been a positive process for us in Darien so far. There's no issue with that.
Great.
Same with us in Reading. Absolutely, really pleased with the process, with the public outreach. I learned a lot, even that, you know, I think if you've warned us, you may not get a lot of people at these in public sessions, but the feedback that you did get was really insightful and valuable. I felt so.
Plus, the second piece is the online survey that we did, and Town of Reading has almost as many responses as we got from the entire state of Texas on a related project. So we're calling Reading, Texas.
Don't mess with
us. So what's an existing site? Pretty silly distinction here, but it's anything that was designed and constructed after January 26th of 1992. That's subject to the 1991 standards. And then if it was designed and constructed after March 15 of 2012, then it's subject to the 2010 standards. The 1991 standards just included typical built environment assets like parking and doors and restrooms. The 2010 standards added park assets, playgrounds, sports fields, basketball courts, pickleball courts, skate parks, and so forth. You've got pickleballers out there playing today in the drizzle. It's important to know the reg and the standards though, so that you can stay in the driver's seat. If you wind up in a settlement agreement or being compelled to compliance, you have to do everything in 3 years. If you stay in the driver's seat, you can stretch that out over a period of time that matches your resources and still meets the mandate. What's a transition plan? Pretty simply put, it's a phased schedule of retrofit. It has to identify every deficit. So your site reports and the transition plan may be long, especially if you're a larger municipality. It has to recommend a solution or a treatment for each deficit, and that can include leave it as is until it's later replaced or altered. You have to identify the position responsible for the transition plan. So Director of Public Works or ADA coordinator or whomever you wish for that person to be. And then you have to note by when the work will occur. We typically recommend that this occur in phases, with each phase varying from 3 to as many as 5 years, depending on the number of deficits that you have and the number of resources that you have. We always add costs. That's not a requirement in the ADA, but we know that no municipality can make a plan like this without cost. So reporting and communication, we want to do this. We want to do this individually. So for each municipality, as we near the end of the cycle for your project, we will arrange for reports to your stakeholders. So whether that's staff leadership or governing board or both, we're happy to do that. At the end of the project, as I mentioned earlier, WestCOG will also receive a cumulative report that will kind of summarize what we saw for each of the 16. Staff leadership piece is particularly important. All of you have designated somebody as the contact person for us, and so we'll work with them to identify any others on staff that we need to participate. A couple of resources before you bombard me with questions. DOJ has a really good hotline. They do a good job of separating enforcement from technical assistance, so don't worry if you wind up calling the 202-514-0301 number when you show up at work the next day. There's not going to be a bunch of people in suits from Washington, D.C. They're great for program and policy. But if it's brick and mortar or dirt and grass or beaches, call the Access Board. They're the small federal agency that created the standards for design and construction of outdoor assets and park assets and buildings. They know this by far better than anybody else. And they've got a great technical assistance service too. There is a national ADA network. They're happy to talk to you about anything, including employment, including universities, including things that we haven't even thought of. So you can reach them at 800-949-4232. There are 7 of those across the country. They all use the same phone number, and they're more clever than I am. They can figure out where you're calling from, and they connect you to your local ADA assistance center. We love to talk about this. So, whoops, I
Sorry,
did 2 there.
that's me.
Come on. If your team raises a question and you call WestCOG or you want to reach out to us, feel free to do that. As I said, I lead the accessibility practice. Tatum is our master of logistics and information. I will say we've had great working experience with the WestCOG staff. Mike Wilson, who I know is not here, but I believe is.
He's on virtually.
with us.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike, he has been great to work with. If he doesn't know the question or the answer to the question, he gets to us as soon as he can. So, and Kristen's been a pleasure to work with, and the occasional times that we see Francis, he too has been easy to work with. So I'll back up, not literally you're on the screen, but can I answer questions from any of you about the project or anything related to compliance. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. How often do these plans need to be updated?
That's a great question. The Title II regulation doesn't have a date requirement for updates, but many accreditation programs. So in particular for Parks and Recreation, it's recommended, actually, it's not recommended. For a municipal parks department to get the commission on accreditation of park and recreation agencies, they have to have a fresh transition plan every 10 years. From a smart practice perspective, that's probably about right. Especially a community your size, you're replacing things, you're changing out playgrounds, you're acquiring something new, you're raising something old. So I think about once every 10 years makes sense.
So John, with this, if you're gonna do an update every decade or so, would it make sense for municipality to have a log of improvements and changes they made in interim just to facilitate the update to the plan?
Yes, and so one of the things that we can do in the final deliverable is give you what we call task tracker. So it's Excel. I'm sure that somebody can convert it to a smart sheet or some other tool. So we developed Task Tracker when we were working with a handful of communities that were under Department of Justice settlement agreement. So it has all the information that transition plan has, but then column K says playground replacement included in town budget, January 1, 2029. Bids let for playground replacement, April 2029. Playground installed, June of 2029, and then playground inspected by name of town employee on August of 2029 and signed off as compliant. So that's a great way for you to kind of keep track of, here's the literally thousands of projects that we would have done over the course of 10 years. And some of the projects aren't going to be brick and mortar. It's going to be making sure that the garbage and recycling bins aren't stored by the door so that they block maneuvering clearance if I use a mobility button. So a lot of these are low hanging fruit, things that you can do with current human and physical resources. Others? I surrender the clicker,
Okay, very good. Thank
which
you,
I have
John.
used. Yes.
One other question. I'm kind of curious what happens when the compliance is a matter of judgment, say, along a continuum. It says full compliance in an extreme case, right, which would require either substantial remediation or design, or actually just tearing everything down and starting over again, say, to describe hypothetical extreme, versus something that gets close enough, right? In other words, there's an elevator on the far end of the building, but not one right here on this side of the building. At what point, how does those types of cases where it's maybe a judgment call as to just how far someone's got to go to comply with these regulations, and how is that adjudicated, and how can municipalities do a better job in their own work to make sure they don't cross over, say a line?
That's a good question. There are a handful of places in the Title II regulation where municipalities are given some discretion, or where you can say that a circumstance exists that makes compliance technically infeasible. Some of you have very hilly communities. So where you have naturally occurring steep terrain, for example, if you have trails, it's going to be hard to make the trails meet the compliance slope. So that is a technical and feasibility issue. There might be, in the event, and honestly, candidly, we don't see this very often, but there might be an undue economic burden where the cost of a project that would retrofit an asset is so great that you can claim that it's an undue economic burden. But you have to consider the entire fiscal resources of the jurisdiction before you do that. There are some others too. So I mentioned the soft task, the program and policy analysis. If you have a building that's not accessible, but you've got another building that is accessible, you might find yourself in a situation where you leave the building that's inaccessible as it is, but you take those same programs and duplicate them and offer them in the building that is accessible. There's nothing wrong with doing that either. The Department of Justice has also, in settlement agreements, given jurisdiction 1, 2, 3 years to make an inaccessible site accessible. So we often find somebody has plans to build a new community center. The old community center is not accessible. It gets to continue to operate until the new one is constructed and open, as long as it's within a 3-year period. So there are some interpretive things like that. And I should mention staff training. It wasn't one of the slides, but we, in our response to WestCOG, offered to each quad 2 free staff trainings. So one will be on infrastructure, and it will review real life disputes and what the requirements are. And the other will be on program and policy issues. So we had originally thought that we would offer all those toward the end of the project. We're not going to do that. We're going to offer them as a part of each quad. So sometime around the end of this first quad, we'll work with WestCOG to schedule both a program and policy training and an infrastructure training, and it'll address questions exactly like that. And you can feel free to go to the training that's for quad 4 or for quad 1, or go to all 8 of them if your staff wants to. Yes.
Just in answer to John's question, we did have a complaint filed on parking. And what we ended up doing is measuring the slope of all of our parking places. The library had to repave an area in order to be in compliance, and it wasn't off that much. We had to restripe several areas, and there's a conflict with DOJ in the state of Connecticut relative to the signs.
Yes.
There's a federal sign and a state sign.
Yes.
And we had just ordered all the state signs, thinking we were doing the right thing, and they said, no, they're not allowable, but apparently at the end, they've allowed us to go with those until we replace them with the new federal ones.
Yeah, there is that. The Connecticut sign is, for those who haven't seen it, it's the more mobile looking racing figure icon. The argument from the DOJ side is that that standard sitting icon has been around for 45, 50 years, and it's recognized by everybody. So why mess with something that everybody knows what it looks like? It's kind of like changing the logo for Coca-Cola, I guess.
Or exit signs in Connecticut.
Exactly. Well, I'll take your word for that. We would lean towards the Connecticut sign as being more stringent because it's different than the federal sign. But I'm not the Department of Justice. But we would lean towards that. We've seen signs like that. We've seen different size striping for accessible parking. So that's a key part of this too. You have to meet whichever is more stringent, the federal requirement or the
And
Connecticut
it's been
requirement.
2 years. And just now our attorney sent what hopefully is the final agreement back to DOJ.
Can you have both? I mean, it seems silly, but can you have both federal and state signage?
You can, but I don't
I don't think you'd want
I don't
2
think you
signs
want
in the
to.
same spot.
I'm not saying I want any of
Yeah,
that.
we have
I
the
also-
same issue. Rich.
I also don't want people
Cheaper
with
than
suits.
getting sued, right?
I am also don't want
Yeah.
people with suits and guns showing up, so.
Yeah.
Well, just
It's not that
remember,
bad.
you know, relief under the ADA is injunctive in nature. So if you put up the racing icon sign for parking and somebody does file a complaint, the worst that's gonna happen is that you're gonna be told to replace it with the I'm standing still in my wheelchair sign.
Until the state of Connecticut shows up and says, where is the racing sign?
Yes.
John, I'm wondering how you selected the grouping of towns, because for instance, our 2 towns are the tiny towns, we're Stride, New Milford. Why wouldn't we all be in the same spot?
I know, and I've driven through both on the way to New Milford. Some of it was readiness. If we had a complete site list from New Milford, then that elevated them to quad 1. I think we are still lacking, I'm looking for Mike, but of course he's not here. I think we're still lacking a couple of site lists, but that's fine. There's another 18 months of project. So that was a factor as well. Others?
Just there's no state of Connecticut DOJ, right?
I don't believe so.
ADA arm that enforces.
Yeah, I don't believe so. There is a Connecticut Human Rights Act. And some states like Illinois where we are headquartered, the Attorney General's office does have a Disability Rights Bureau. And they do go out and enforce Illinois requirements as well as the ADA requirements too.
The final question I have is when we do a capital project, are we in fact required to allocate 20% of that capital project to ADA compliance?
So that's a good question. One of the crystal clear pieces of the ADA is that if it is new construction, it must be fully compliant. But if it is an alteration, or let's say it's an addition to this building, if there's an addition to this building, then the addition must be fully compliant. Then 20% is allocated to the path of travel. So think like you're a wheelchair user. Path of travel starts as you're pulling into the parking lot. So I've got to have accessible parking. There's got to be accessible signage. I've got to be able to get to the door on a slope that doesn't exceed 5%. There's got to be a level landing there. The door's got to open with less than 8.5 pounds of force. I've got to be able to get in there, maneuver through the hallway, find this door, open it with less than 5 pounds of force. So all of that could add up to the 20%, depending on the type of addition that you're using. So I would say the answer to your question is no, unless it's an addition or an alteration. But if it's new construction, it's gotta be fully compliant. And I will guarantee you that for some of you who have new construction, we will find things that are not compliant. Access is a function of, did the designer get it right? Did the contractor get it right? And you know darn well that the interface between design and construction is never perfect. And then are your own team maintaining the asset correctly? So all three of those factors can make a site not be accessible. Yes.
Standard of accessibility change over time, so if I built a new building that was ADA compliant at the time it was received its CO and I maintained it, can I expect it to stay in compliance, or are there changes to the regulations that we have to understand and that could potentially take a certified building or an ADA compliant building and make it out of compliance?
No. So the design standards have changed just twice, 1991 and then in 2010. In a normal world, I'd say look for a change around 2030. So that's typically been the cycle.
So you're just held to the standard that was in existence when the building was constructed?
Correct. So it's called the concept of safe harbor. If you diligently made sure that the 1999 building complied with the 1991 standards, and then the size of the restroom changed in 2010, or the height of reach range for operating mechanisms like light switches changed in 2010, as long as yours were compliant with the 1991 standard, you don't have to go back in and change them. So reach range was allowed to be 54 inches. So when we audit, if we know the building was built in 1999, but your light switches are at 56 inches, not 54 inches, you fail. And now it's got to go down to 48 inches, not 54 inches. Does that make sense? So safe harbor applied, but I mentioned that park assets were not included until 2010. There's no safe harbor for park assets, but there is for facilities.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Thank you all very much.
And when do you expect to wrap up the project? What is the timeline on that?
Summer 2026.
Yeah,
Yeah, fall, late summer,
Yeah.
2026.
Thank you,
thank you.
appreciate it.